Hey everyone, it's Matt here. You're listening to THEATRE XYZ Encore, a companion episode to your regularly scheduled XYZ. You'll hear a behind-the-scenes interview with David Holcomb. Hope you enjoy his insider tips as much as we did.
Hi there, I'm David Holcomb. I am the production manager at Carnegie Mellon University School of Drama, where I production manage the season, and I also teach in the stage and production management program.
Thank you. Welcome. So the topic that we're discussing today for our podcast, Theater XYZ, we want to talk about 10 out of 12s. We're talking about work-life balance inside the theater. We're also going to be talking about the show must go on mentality. I think through a conversation that you and I had, David, I discovered that you had somehow magically gotten rid of 10 out of 12s. Is that true?
Like it was not a hard thing at all. Gone.
So, Bailey, you have a question first up. Let's start with you.
So we kind of asked everyone to talk to their friends about, 10 out of 12s. My biggest question is definitely in work-life balance. I feel like we don't have great ones in this industry. So where did the pressure to end 10 out of 12s come from? Do you think it was more student-driven, faculty-driven, outside influences?
That's a good question. I guess I became aware of a growing movement to get 10 out of 12s, make them go away in the theater industry. And I kind of brought that back to the school myself. There are other folks within the school who had kind of heard about this a bit as well. Yeah, no, I brought it in from the outside.
I mean, were you overwhelmed? Were you stressed? What were your reasons for wanting to get that train moving?
It's really more about my continual concern for, at least in my context at Carnegie Mellon, my concern for the students' health and well-being, and seeing that this is a, practice that the industry uses that I feel is not particularly healthy for anybody. And our school was emulating that practice, more or less like a lot of schools do things to prepare people for the industry that they're going to be entering. But I thought, if I don't think the industry should be doing this, why should we be doing this?
David, you mentioned outside resources. Was that just conversations with other production managers or conversations with other educators?
It was mostly other production managers. It was mostly other production managers, and just talking about, how difficult it is on people's lives to do this. I guess I would say that I find production folks have an even more visceral reaction to 10 out of 12s than performers, who I believe the 10 out of 12 was built around. Because, of course, as those of us in production know, what is 10 out of 12 hours of work for performers on a tech day really means more like 14 out of 12 for technical folks, or possibly even more, depending on the environment.
That's really true. That's certainly something that we've been discussing as our existence as well.
Sure.
What have you seen any really tangible positives coming out of them? Has the reception to it been positive for the most part?
Yeah, very much so, actually. So I guess I would back it up a step before the responses and talk a little bit about the implementation. Mm-hmm. When I brought it up in meetings of faculty members, and particularly in faculty who teach in the directing area, I thought I might have a bit of a hard sell there, because I thought, well, those folks are going to say, but you're losing me hours of rehearsal time. And I was fully ready to engage in a conversation that went down the path of, okay, so if we're not doing 10 out of 12s, can we add more days to the tech process to gain back some of those hours we would be losing by not doing such long days, right, in hours? And to my surprise, the directing faculty, all of whom are professional directors and work regularly all over the place, but whose main concern at the school is for the student director's experience and their learning, the response from the faculty was, let's just do less hours. This is crazy. The late hours of a 10 out of 12 day, the last couple hours of that day are kind of useless anyway. Why are we putting ourselves and everybody through it? Let's just stop doing that. And then when I asked the follow-up question of, do we then need to add hours someplace else? The answer was no. No, we'll just do it in less hours. So we will figure out how many hours we have for tech and create the show within the box that we've got and not try to push the box further than it can be, which I thought was a really great response. I have to say, to provide even more context, for us, we not only eliminated 10 out of 12s, but once we get into Tech Week in the before times, we would do rehearsals that would go for 5 hours up until 11:30 at night, mostly getting students out of the building by about midnight-ish. That is, the performing students, the tech students, and the stage managers who were following up and doing all the paperwork were getting out by 1 a.m. And they would have classes at 9 or 10. And some of the performers would have 8 a.m. classes for certain movement-based things. And the turnaround was just miserable. So not only did we eliminate 10 out of 12s in favor of 8 out of 10s, we also reduced our 5-hour evening rehearsals during the week to 4-hour evening rehearsals that got out at 10:30 instead of 11:30. So we actually lopped off not just the 2 hours of the single 10 out of 12 we did, but we lopped another 5 hours off a week of tech. Faculty directors were totally willing to do this, and we had a guest director coming in as we were for the following year as we were discussing this, and I threw this question by him while I was at it, and he said, "Oh yeah, absolutely, get rid of those hours. We'll make the show fit in the box we got." I'm like, that's great. That's what we need to do.
That's fantastic. Yeah.
I was really encouraged by that response, particularly from those people.
Of the students who graduated with that model, when they go out in the world, I imagine they stay in touch to some degree. Mm-hmm. Have they been met with similar experiences where they're headed, or are they kind of fighting an uphill battle wherever they end up to kind of argue for this model that you're creating in your training environment?
Well, we've only changed the 10 out of 12 rule a little over a year ago. So we don't have a wealth of students who have left our training and gone into the professional world and figured out how to do that. And of course, they've wandered out into the professional world of COVID. So nobody's doing anything right now, much less 10 out of 12s. Yeah. So we don't have a lot of data to pull back in that sort of way. But I will say, we certainly teach students what a 10 out of 12 is, and that that if they get into the professional world, they may experience those things. But we don't feel that we have to put them through that. There's no need to build up their stamina. We build up the students' stamina with all the other stuff we throw at them already anyway. We don't also have to pile on with a 10 out of 12 to figure out whether they've got stamina to make it through a rehearsal process and a tech process. They've got that. I have no worry about them on that. But the other thing that I would say, I think has been driving me and others certainly around the CMU School of Drama is that we've realized, in the relatively recent past few years, that the way to change the industry isn't to wag our fingers at the industry. It is to change the expectations of the people who are entering the industry so that when they enter the industry with a different expectation of where the industry should meet them. They've already got different expectations about where the industry should meet them just because they are, at this point, they're a different generation of people and they have different ideas, which is great for them and great for the industry because it's pushing us. And, if we can feed in additional ideas like this to their toolkit of expectations, I think it's great. We've seen experience with that in a production management, in a small sort of way. In production management, for years, I have been teaching production management students how to run a meeting differently than the meetings I experienced in the professional world before I started teaching. How many times have you sat through a production meeting or a post-tech meeting where you're there forever waiting to listen to the director talk to the prop person about the 3 props and the lighting designer to talk to the stage manager about how they called that cue and all of that. And we just don't do that anymore. We haven't for years. And I've been teaching students how to do it more cleanly and more efficiently and without wasting a lot of people's times. And what I've been really glad to hear about from testimony from students who have graduated, gone out into the professional world and got into practice as production managers, they've taken that practice with them and changed their companies. And their companies are running better production meetings now because of that. So that's a perfect example of a little bit of teaching, and not only teaching a different way to do things, but also teaching folks while you're teaching them the different way, that it's a different way, and that they will be met with some, kind of challenges potentially out there in the professional world. shows me that by training students to have better expectations for themselves, they can bring those out into the world.
How have you cleaned up that technical rehearsal process?
Mostly it's just about time. And it's about, whenever you're doing a technical rehearsal, you've got to figure out how much you've got to do. You've got to figure out how much you've got to get done. You've got to figure out how many parts there are how many things that need to fit into that, in that box, how many different lighting pieces and scenery pieces, costume pieces, and, how do you get them all in there, and not burst the seams. And we do have a few shows here that are professionally guest or professionally faculty directed. We only have a few of them a year. Most of our shows are directed by students. So those shows who have professionals directing, those folks have a wealth of experience of understanding, what does time mean and what can they really get accomplished in a certain amount of time. The student directors just don't have the same wealth of experience and understanding about how to figure out how much they can get done within a given period of time. Neither do the student lighting designers or the student costume designers or doing quick changes. None of them have a lot of experience with that. And that's what the production is for. It is to give them experience. And they inevitably have trouble with it. But they had trouble with it when they had long ones. It doesn't matter. It's the learning experience doesn't rely on having longer time. The learning experience is learning how to fit within whatever time you do have.
And so how have you cleaned up those either production meetings or those post-tech meetings to make them not last hours after?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
What's the magic potion?
What's the secret,
David?
right? Yeah, tell us.
We need the secret.
It's two phrases, right? So the one phrase, and I have a bin of buttons on my desk in my office when people come into my office. So like some people have a little bucket of candy or something on it. I have a bin of buttons, and the bin of buttons, and I bought them from, there's a sound company out of New York, and I can never remember the exact name of, but I can look it up, that creates these buttons along with other things. And they do some wonderful sound products also, by the way. But these buttons, right? These buttons are, normal size, buttons you'd wear on a shirt or your jacket or whatever. And they say nothing for the group, thank you. So that is one very important phrase.
I'm a fan. I am a huge fan.
So that is the phrase from the participant side. But the phrase from the person who is leading the meeting is, when calling on a different group of participants, is to say, what do you have for everybody? What do you have that lots of people need to hear about?
Mm-hmm. Fantastic.
And it's about setting up the particularly the post-tech meetings, where you're going to go around the room and you're going to ask every department for some input. You say, okay, so let's have our conversation here. Let's keep this meeting specific to things that affect multiple parties. There are absolutely going to be discussions that need to happen between the director and the prop person, and between the lighting designer and the stage manager, and between, blah, 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 blah. And we'll handle those in separate sidebar conversations after the big meeting. So you set up an expectation that those things can happen, but only the people that need to stick around for those things, and you don't drag it out for an hour and a half for everybody. And it means that the folks who only get a few notes can go home and get rested and come back for another thing at a later time. So that's one of the main things for a post-tech meeting, to make that work well. And the thing I would add for a production meeting, so in process before you get into tech, is to run a meeting. And this is just, all of these are from the study of meeting science, which, oh my God, there's actually meeting science? Yes, meeting science.
I'll have to look into that. I'll have to.
I know.
And actually, theater production people have not run meetings very well for probably 100 years.
Yeah, right.
I believe that.
And so when we do production meetings, we cap them at a half an hour. Usually they run significantly shorter than that. One of the things that we absolutely do not do in a production meeting is go around to the room for a report from everybody. That is the death of a meeting, because, when you call in the paint person and they aren't expecting it, they go, well, we bought some paint this week, and because they're making up stuff in their head because they've been called on, because they think they have to say something. And if you don't have anything to say, don't. So, we do stupid things like send out a request for agenda items before the meeting, and then make an agenda, and then follow the agenda. And then, at the end of the agenda, the production manager will go, is there anything else we didn't get to? A couple times until the murmuring dies down. And, so that leaves the opportunity for people to get something in they thought about in the meeting or forgot to put in. but it's not setting up the expectations that the meetings are just going to be, well, you show up and we figure it out in the meeting, because that just wastes everybody's time. So those kind of two practices I've kind of inculcated a generation of production managers to use out in the professional world, and I'm hearing them doing it all the time, which is kind of great. And I wouldn't say that it's unique to me. These are things that, I and some of my colleagues at CMU have learned through studying some meeting science, but also it's things that I have discussed with other professional production managers that I'm acquainted with who have independently started to do some of these same things themselves. And it's, so I'm happy to say we're on the leading edge of making meetings better, but we're not the people who invented that. We just, followed some breadcrumbs.
I love that. I feel like sometimes, especially with student designers or student directors, in those meetings, they're so anxious to let everyone know that, like, yeah, we're staying really busy. We're staying really busy. So then they go on and just say every single thing that they've been doing. And it's like, we know you're doing work. Like, we're proud of you. It's so great. You don't need to tell everyone that, like, you hemmed a pair of pants today. So I think setting that expectation is good, because I feel like students sometimes think they have to share every single thing with the group. So
I will say you're absolutely right. I will say the challenge that we have on the flip side is particularly in tech, well, in both production meetings and post-tech meetings, when we have tried to set up the expectation that in that meeting, it should be discussions that are for more than 2 or 3 people, for a larger group of people. There are students who are newer at meeting these sorts of ways who are uncomfortable with knowing where the line is of should I bring this up or shouldn't I? And some of them will just clam up and not say anything. And sometimes our meeting lasts 5 minutes long and nobody said anything, but really people had things to say. So it's not perfect. And we have to kind of figure out how to kind of reset that pendulum a little bit by having conversations with folks. But it's a little better to be too short and fix it with a bunch of meetings after than be way too long and, want to poke your eyes out.
Yeah. And that must certainly help with keeping inside of that that limited evening time that you've set now for your techs, especially.
It does. I mean, we used to try to get out by 11:30 so that we could have our post-tech meeting, even our shortened post-tech meeting, and be done and get the bulk of people out before midnight. But now the bulk of people are getting out by 11:15 or 11, which is kind of really, as much as changing the 10 out of 12 to an 8 out of 10, the shortening our evenings has been really significant change.
I feel like that would just help with general mood too. After a 10 out of 12, you're sitting in the room all day, you're getting grumpy, and then you're listening to someone else blather on before you can go on, and you're like getting even more annoyed and more agitated, and you're just not in a great headspace for creation and for making art and for fixing the problems that occur during the day.
All these things.
Part of our research with this podcast, I was asking some of my friends who are millennials their thoughts on 10 out of 12s, how it's affected their relationships. And I tried to come at it from a very unbiased point of view. What are the pros? What are the cons? And it was really interesting. These people that I've been friends with for a really long time really got vulnerable with me. And they were like, it's the 10 out of 12s and the show must go on mentality and the 6-day work weeks has completely impacted my life in every single way. I am incredibly anxious. Even on my days off, I have this fear of not being productive enough, or if I have a day off, I should fill it with some freelance work. And they really feel like the industry has on their days off, they feel like they either need to do everything fun at once because they can't do it during the work week, or they feel like they're wasting their day off, or they get so overwhelmed that they can't do anything. Most of them are leaving the industry because they feel like it's ruining their mental health. Have you experienced that? Have you seen your students or colleagues experience that? Do you feel like the way you've changed your schedule has kind of eased some of that mental burden?
Well, I hope it's helped that mental burden. You're absolutely right. And that's a large part of the reason to do that. But yeah, those things you're testifying to there, or your friend was testifying to there, are exactly the reasons behind doing something like this. For somebody of my generation, I'm a Gen Xer. There you go. Grew up in a slightly different feeling theater world than certainly millennials have, and way different than Gen Z folks are going to make it, which I think is, I have to say, all positive. And even the boomers before me, frankly. I don't think, certainly when I was coming up in the industry or when my predecessors were coming up in the industry, there was a lot of talk about work-life balance. I mean, there certainly was some out there in the ether in the world because, people talked about it a little bit, but not really in our industry, right? We all didn't, we're pretty clammed up about it because we had that show must go on mentality. And it's worse than that. I mean, it's a badge of honor, right? To be able to get your way through that and you've achieved the thing. And not only have you created great art, but you've suffered for your art.
Yeah, bragging about hardships.
Oh, it's terrible. And I think that as I look back on my time kind of coming up in the industry, I can't recall ever hearing anybody say, this is too hard, I'm going to get out of it. But I know a lot of people who did get out of it. And it makes me think, how many of those people that got out of it because it was too hard. It was unreasonably hard, inhumanely hard. And by the way, it's also classist, elitist, and racist. Shall we talk about those things? Because they are right there on the surface. And as I talk to the millennials who are choosing to stay in the industry or not choosing to stay in the industry, this is a factor for them, and they're talking about that. Some people choose to leave the industry because they find that, for lots of other reasons, it's not fulfilling, or they find something else that's interesting, or who knows what. There's a lot of reasons people leave a lot of industries. I'm stubborn. I've stuck in it for a long time. But that's just me. That's not, everybody should not emulate me. That's me.
But you're enacting change along the way.
Well, I hope so. At least I hope I'm open to learning and keeping growing and helping move things forward in a positive direction. That's kind of how I choose to stay in it.
Do you feel like you have a positive work-life balance, or what did it take to get to a positive work-life balance, if you do have one?
Have you achieved the goal?
Yeah.
I do. I feel pretty comfortable with my work-life balance. I have to say, like probably for a lot of people, it's been thrown off by the pandemic, but I've kind of regained it. Not perfectly, because we're still in pandemic and it's not great. But I have expectation to be able to regain it when we're on the other side of this, even if slowly and bits by pieces. So I think God, how long ago was it? It was, I'm going to say 12, 13, 14 years ago. I did a study. The head of our school was interested in knowing, how we spent our time, not how many hours we spent doing our work, but in how we divvied up the work in terms of what percentage of our time we spend on particular items, because we wanted to make sure that we as a school were spending our effort on the things we thought were the most important. So we wanted to know if we were. And not everybody engaged in this, but I certainly did. And I grabbed myself some little tools to track my time. And so I tracked my time against, I think, 7 metrics of, teaching. I don't even remember what they were. 7 metrics. Being in meetings, answering emails, what are you spending your time doing? And the simple tools allowed me to go, okay, I check in, I'm doing some stuff. And when I changed my activities, I could go to this tool and say, oops, now I'm doing this. And it would, roughly track my total time, as well as kind of percentages of what kind of activities I was doing within that, which was kind of great. And I did that for, I'm going to say a couple of months, because I wanted to have some serious data to really, because my job changes a little bit over time. In one week, it's going to be very heavy doing one thing, and another week, it's going to be very heavy doing another thing, and so on and so forth. So I wanted to have kind of a breadth of time to be able to see, a 1 week sliver of my time is not going to give you a good picture of how my percentages lie out over average. And so what I learned was where I was spending the most of my time and what I appeared to be valuing the most. And it allowed me to think about that and think about, with my supervisor, what we thought I should be doing, and talk about that and go, I should change what I'm doing. I should not do this thing that I'm doing here. I should do less of this. And I should do more of that. Or frankly, I'm doing too many hours, so I should lessen the things that we should not be doing. And, my supervisor was all on top of that. And thought it was great and a good idea. And that kind of study of my own work, which seems a little academic, it is academic, gave me the data I needed to be able to think about making decisions in the moment on a day-to-day basis of what am I doing. Am I spending time doing something I should do? Well, I don't know. So what was I doing before this podcast? Well, I got out of class about an hour and a half before this. And so what did I do? So you find yourself in those moments and you want to make the choices that are, at least as far as your work, propelling your work along well. And as far as your personal life, giving yourself the freedom to say, I need time to go take care of this thing, whatever it is, and make time for that thing that feeds you, right? And so I kind of developed those about, I'm going to say 13 years ago ish. And I've had a pretty healthy relationship to that since then.
It seems like the data has given you the picture, right? So you could then take control of
Yes.
of what you learned. That's an amazing approach.
Yep. Actually, I guess two things. One, the data was key, but the other thing that I kind of got hooked on right around the same time was there's a book called Getting Things Done by David Allen, which is a bit of it's been around for a decade and a half, maybe 2 decades now. So it's not the freshest book out there, but it's a book. And it's all about personal productivity. And it has a kind of a unique approach to personal productivity. But the thing I like about it a lot is in portions of it, it talks about your personal relationship to the work you have to do and how to renegotiate your commitments. Not only your commitments to your employer or to the project you're working on, but how to renegotiate commitments with yourself. Because frequently at least I would find, and I think it probably works for other folks as well, I would say, I'm going to do this thing on this date and time, and I'd have it in my head, and that date and time would pass, and I'd be mad at myself for not getting that thing done, whatever that thing was. But if I had a system that reminded me that I had the thing to do, and I also had the permission with myself to renegotiate my deadlines, I could see that thing coming, and rather than be agitated by it, scared about it, angry that I can see I'm not going to get it done by that time, I know that I have the permission with myself to say, well, I'm not going to do that now. Let me look at my schedule and see when I can do that and move it out to a later time. And that's, that works to an extent with professional things, because you do have control over some of your deadlines professionally, not all of them. Some of them you just can't avoid. But the important fact that I really didn't understand until I was kind of going through that book is, part of it is you need to not let yourself down. You have to figure out how to give yourself permission to do something different. And between that and using the data about the time, those two things really kind of came together in a way that allowed me to figure out how to empower myself to find a good work-life balance.
That sounds a lot like bullet journaling in a bigger way. I find when I do my bullet journaling, I give myself permission to reprioritize, like which task is going to have to come first and which one I can let go for the next week because it's just not as urgent as I had originally thought. That ability to give ourselves permission to reduce our expectation on a certain part of our world and then move it to a different line of importance is super valuable.
Or even to let go of it sometimes.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, I don't need to do that whenever.
Did you just add a question?
I did. So part of the journey of this podcast and a lot of our inspiration is coming from the We See You White American Theater document.
Absolutely.
Which talks about classism, racism, and sexism that you just brought up. So can you go a little more into that?
Sure. And particularly in things like the 10 out of 12s, the 6-day work week, all those things are things that are, they're racist because they're not anti-racist, to put it bluntly. They are just practices that they're not only racist, they're sexist, they're classist, they are all those things. To be able to survive in a world that expects you to do multiple 10 out of 12s in 1 week, you need incredible resources to be able to do that. In our country, it is a sad fact that people of color don't have the same resources that white people do. So if you're requiring, people to have a lot of personal resources, then only the people with those personal resources are going to be able to survive that well. And the people who don't aren't. The same personal resources challenges affect people with disabilities. They affect people with children. They affect people with older parents in the home that they have to care for. They affect people with of lower socioeconomic status for whatever reason. These kinds of, show must go on, badge of honor sort of practices are really harsh on a lot of different populations. But they're very definitely racist, classist, sexist, all those things. People who have trouble getting to public transportation or ready access to good transportation have trouble getting home from a late call or a 10 out of 12 call. They have trouble making it to a late call or an early call. These things can affect people of lots of different backgrounds negatively. And I really appreciate that we see what folks for calling those two out in particular, along with everything else they've called out, which is a spectacular document. Those two things, along with a lot of things in their document, are things that would really be better for everybody, not just for people of color. So why are we not doing these things? I mean, do we really want to keep the people of color down so much? I can't believe that's the reason we're doing these things. But that's the effect that these things are having. So we should really examine them and fix them.
So that's going to dovetail really nicely into my question, which is, I mean, you've already defined a really great plan, and I'm going to start looking up this book and ways to implement your work-life balance ethos that you seem to lay out there. But how do you go about breaking the cycle of the theater mentality of personal sacrifices that support the show must go on mentality, or do what we have to get this show up? Besides planting the seeds in our future industry professionals, how do we deal with old school thinking patterns? How do we break that cycle?
What's that saying about old dogs and new tricks?
Yeah.
So there are folks who have been around for a long time and are fairly set in their ways, who can become open to new ways. I mean, I can think of production management graduate student who left our program a couple of years ago, who graduated, who got a position as a production manager, working with a director of production. So she was not in the lead position, but the second position. A position they were wanting to groom her into the lead position eventually because the director of production was, nearing retirement age. Thankfully, the director of production, who again had been around for a long time and done things the way he'd done them for a long time, was very willing to have her come in and say, "Hey, I'd like to try a new thing." And she would try a new thing and the place wouldn't burn down and it would work. So I think that there are people who've been around for a long time who are willing to hear new ideas and learn and grow. But I'm not sure they're a majority. I think for every one of those, there is somebody who's reached a level of power in our industry. And by power, I mean, they're a production manager somewhere, they're an artistic director somewhere, they're a director somewhere, and they've been doing it long enough that people defer to them for how to operate. And they just continue to operate the way that they have, that works for them, and aren't interested in hearing your idea, whatever that is, you youngster, or anybody, frankly. I don't have a silver bullet on how to deal with those people, except to try not to work with those people, number one. And here's the radical one, right? And this is what I do. This is my response to what do you do with old racists? You make life so uncomfortable for them with your newness that they move on. And then you can continue with the better thing. It's not honoring your elders, but it's fixing the problem. So, that's a little radical. And, speaking as an older guy, to say the answer is to push the old guys out of the way, that might be the right thing in some cases. And I have to say, it's not just old guys. I've run into plenty of older women who have internalized their own misogyny, who have internalized their own racism, who act the same way that the old guys do because that's the way they came up in the world.
Or that's what they see power looks like, so they try to emulate that
Or they
a lot
do.
of time
It's
too.
worked for them. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sorry, but those people need to be moved on just as much as the old white guys who are a problem. And there's plenty of them. I don't mean to be anti-white guys. There's plenty of good white guys out there too, but there's some problem ones.
Not all men, but definitely that one.
And that one, and that one, and that one, and that one.
Yeah.
There's plenty of them. Yeah.
I love that, making them uncomfortable with your newness.
Yeah. Making them uncomfortable with the way of the world,
and let them be the ones to move on.
Have you seen any negatives come out of ending the 10 out of 12 at all?
Nothing significant, no. I think it's funny that we got a little bit of pushback from, of all folks, the lighting folks, who were like, "Oh, that's going to shorten my tech time." Well, yes, it is.
Yeah.
It's going to shorten everybody's tech time.
Yeah.
So what do you do about that? Do less.
Yeah, work more efficiently. Have you noticed any drop in like production value or anything like that?
No, not at all. No,
Yeah.
not at all.
Does it take any more effort in the beginning process?
Well, it didn't for us. I mean, we published a schedule and then we just stuck to that schedule. And we didn't really talk about how it was going to be different as we were operating in that new schedule. We just kind of did it. And then, myself and a few folks who were instrumental in trying to push it forwards, after meetings during that first, large tech with 10 out of 12s that weren't 10 out of 12s and weren't late nights, kind of looked around and went, "Wow, this was kind of nice, wasn't it?" This was kind of nice. Excellent. Did anybody mind it? No, nobody seems to have minded. Awesome. We got away with it. It's what we
Yeah.
we opened the conversation a little bit more and we actually asked people and people were like, "Yeah, it was nice. It was good." I brought it up with my students in class. They're like, "Oh my God, thank God we're not doing those anymore."
Yeah.
Now I got time to, actually finish up my stage manager report and then go do homework and still be in class by 9 a.m. Did I mention we are fine with stamina around here?
I have, so you changed your tech process from a 10 out of 12 to an 8 out of 10.
Yep.
Could you see any positives or negatives coming from even changing that a little bit and maybe having 2 separate days of tech as opposed to one? Even though it's shorter, it's still a long day. What about like 2 6-hour days or 2 7-hour days as opposed to
supposed to one long day?
Yeah, or even like 1 5-hour day, 2 5-hour days to give you still the 10 hours.
Well, I think that would absolutely be better. Yeah. So a longer number of days of tech process with shorter spans of each day, I think would, even if you're trying to keep the same number of hours, would still be better than working long days. Luckily, we didn't have to expand the number of days of tech because people just bought into the idea of doing less. But I think if people don't buy into the idea of doing less, I think the idea of doing the same amount spread out over more days is still a better idea.
So the secret is you can, if you can get buy-in from the faculty or the staff, with 1 or 2 rotations of students, if anybody pushes back, they'll be out the door after graduation and it won't matter. So then you've just instituted it over a couple of years and it's done. And people don't know they don't remember the before time.
That's right. Yeah, we're going into the 6-day work week next.
Okay.
We're having trouble with that one right now because of COVID, because COVID has, and this is interesting. So what COVID has done to us, because we're not actually rehearsing anything right now, we're not doing any shows this fall, but we're planning them for the spring. There'll be digital performances, but we have to figure out our rehearsal calendar for those, right? And so we're talking about those things. And when we're talking about how many hours a day you can rehearse on Zoom versus how many hours a day you can rehearse in a rehearsal room, just because of fatigue and oh my God, what we've come down to is everybody said, "Oh yeah, we can't rehearse in Zoom for more than 3 hours a day." Well, that automatically just dropped off a whole pile of hours of rehearsal for our 4-week rehearsal process, right? We just dropped an hour a day for 6 days a week. That's 6 times 4, 24 hours of rehearsal, which just went out the door, which for us is like a week of rehearsal. And so while we were talking about how are we going to shape the rehearsal period before tech, the rehearsal period, In the spring, we were talking about 3 hours a day, Monday through Friday, and a 3-hour day on Saturday, probably late morning. And I just kept inserting every time that topic came up. 6-day work week, ? We see you what? Reminding everybody. And the response I get back on that one and I found this rather interesting, coming back from one of the directing colleagues, was, yeah, you're right about that, but we need to deal with COVID first, and then we can deal with that. And their point is we've just reduced the number of rehearsal hours down to so little that they had a hard time imagining how to see more. We have a new interim head of our school who caught me on the side after those and said, you're absolutely right about the 6-day work week thing. And here's my goal. And she's so clever about this. She said, here's my goal. We have reduced the number of hours of every day because we're rehearsing in COVID land. So our weekly total of hours has now just dropped by 6 hours because it's an hour off of every call 6 days a week, right? So when we come out of the COVID times and we're thinking about what rehearsal should look like back in a rehearsal hall, we know that we can rehearse a show with 6 hours less of rehearsal in a week. So by that time, we're going to just be able to drop that Saturday rehearsal. But he's seeing the next step as, okay, so we're using this, COVID times, reduced hours experiment to prove to people that we can rehearse the show in fewer hours, and we should just do that. I'm like, okay, I'm with you on that one. There, I'm with you.
A little bit of a gambit, right?
It is, but also when we get there, we can just go, oh, it's the right thing to do, so we should just do it.
100%. It works so nicely for you. They're buying into the 6 hours less a week, and then you can just, oh, by the way.
We'll do that anyway.
Yeah.
I would really like to have, the 6-day work week was next on my bucket list. So once we had solved the 10 of the 12s, I was planning to say, okay, so let's knock off one of these rehearsal days a week. And that's when we all went away for COVID. So it was hard to bring that up, even though I kept trying.
I feel like a lot of times in theater, efficiency gets sacrificed for like creative freedom sometimes. So I think that'll be really interesting. I feel like a lot more things that we do in the industry could be more efficient if we're just like, yeah, you just have to get it done. Like you can't change your mind about that 15 times.
So I'm going to push back on that one a little bit, and I'll explain why.
Sure.
You're right. If we have a box of the show and we need to fit the show in the box, then we're all pros, or we're training to be pros, and we can figure out how to fit the thing in the box we've got. Great. But there's a natural tension between creation and resource.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a natural tension, but it's a false tension, which is kind of interesting because in a certain way, having a box requires you to examine the box and figure out how you're going to work within it in a way that having unlimited resources and unlimited, unfettered imagination time doesn't necessarily focus you appropriately for a creative person. Some, yes, but a lot, no. So there's that. So that creation thing is an understandable kind of tension there. But the other thing that I'll say is, and I can't remember what webinar or podcast or something I was attending on decolonizing theatrical design, I think is what it was. Actually, I can't remember whose it was, but somebody's. Maybe American Theater Wing. I'm going to back my way into this. American Theater Wing, decolonizing theater design podcast recently. That was you might want to check out. That was kind of interesting. One of the designers talked about that tension in a very clear sort of way. He's an older gentleman, been in the business for a very long time, well-established, good career. He knows his shit. One of the problems he has in working on shows is the rigidity of the resource box that shows are given sometimes. And the feeling that sometimes that kind of resource footprint, whatever, particularly in time, that kind of resource footprint is arbitrary and not necessarily productive for creation. I'm not talking about the money, but I'm talking about the time. This is all stuff we spend, right? We spend time, we spend money, we spend, human capital, we spend all these things. And you have to think about how you spend time also, because honestly, time is money in a certain way. So, but his point which I think is what I'm going to say counter to what you're saying earlier, that you have to be careful about when you're talking about what you were talking about earlier, that different people see the time resources differently and see their ability to create within a schedule differently. And some creative folks need a different time allotment to do their work. And those that are good, that have experience, and that have the clout to demand the time they need can get that. But particularly for those who are younger and newer at it, sometimes they have a hard time getting the time that they need to do the work that they need to do. So, yeah, that can be a challenge. Sorry about that. It's 4:00.
What are the solutions to all the variables that come up in theater? When people can't accomplish the things as planned, do we plan a better budget? Do we create better scheduling? Is it logistical planning? Like what's the magic recipe?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't think there is a magic recipe, and that's the problem, right? Because, one day you're making, beef stew, the next day you're making vegetarian chili, and the next day you're making salad, right? And so the recipes are different for all those things, and they all take a different amount of time. And, one takes an Instant Pot and the other takes a knife. So the tools are different and the time is different. And I think the real challenge is being able to identify what the resource needs for each piece are that you're going to do, and looking at each piece individually rather than trying to think of yourself as, or your organization as having, this is the way we do shows. That can work for a lot of shows. And certainly there's, there are a lot of shows that have, similar recipes. So you can use the same, path for those things. But they're not all the same. And some need a different financial footprint, a different time footprint, a different number of people working on it. And it's hard to accurately assess those things in advance. So number one, you need to try to do that. assess the required elements for each thing. And you need to be able to figure out how to adjust, if you can, mid-process to get you where you're going. And by that, I don't necessarily mean you have to figure out how to throw more money at it, or how to throw more people at it, or how to throw more time at it, because if you have more time in your back pocket to throw at something, maybe it's those things. But maybe it's also looking at the goal that you're trying to create and changing that a little bit to fit what you've got. And I think that is the tension for students in theater, to figure out, how you go from one place to another. So I teach from a project management book, because a lot of what we do as production managers is really classic project management from, the commercial world. But there's a very significant difference between the way production managers work as opposed to project managers in other environments. And the very significant difference that we have is that we have a hard opening date. We're going to have butts in seats expecting to see a thing at a specific time. And so we can't, which you would do in other environments, look at how your project is progressing and decide, we're not going to be able to achieve this part of the goal within the timeline we had estimated. So we're going to have a little schedule slippage, and we're going to come out a little bit later. We're going to deliver a little bit later. When you're building a building, it's okay to take another week or a month to finish a piece that got designed a little funny, or got teched a little funny, or got built wrong the first time, or somebody just had a better idea mid-process and we wanted to change it. Because that building is going to stand there for 50 to 100 years. And that, month on the front end of the design and build process is not going to matter 50 years later. But in our world, the opening doesn't change. We can't open the building later to get it perfect. Perfect in some way for us is the enemy of the good. And the good is to put a quality product on the stage, or in our case, to educate students well, you have to be able to let go of some of the perfection you're striving for. That doesn't mean to settle or not care or those things, but it means to be realistic.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank
I think
you.
that's the secret sauce. It's finding that. It's hard to do. That takes time.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Anybody have last questions of any kind?
I have a question. What are you going to do with this?
We're going to take pieces of this interview. We're going to do like so we were talking to this person who has this great viewpoint, and we'll roll you in that way.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
All of the magical secret sauce moments and all the good stuff, all the wisdom. It's going to be a 4-hour podcast at this point.
I know. I'm like, I don't even know what we can edit out of that whole conversation.
Yeah.
That was an awful lot. And so I didn't intend to spew so much, but hey, those were good questions.
Oh, no, it's so helpful. It's so helpful.
Great information. I mean, your thought process and your point of view is phenomenal. And I'm glad that I got to be part of this, and I'm glad I got to hear it. And I hope that we can take some of this knowledge and run with it on our end as well.
Cool.
So thank you.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Happy.
I feel like we've just experienced a masterclass in like,
right.
I know.
I was just absorbing knowledge the whole time. Just
you got some of the top level stuff for me. There's a lot. There's a lot down there. It's good. It's good.
If you liked what you heard, listen to Theater XYZ, Work-Life Balance, where we took what we learned from David and discussed it with a current student at Lehigh. Find us on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Facebook, and Instagram for all past and upcoming episodes. Just search LU Theater. That's theater ending with an RE, LU Theater Podcast Series.